Okay, so it looks like we're live. And Walter just came.
Good.
Great.
Bye.
Okay, so welcome everyone to. Actually, hold on one second. I got some feedback. Okay.
Yeah, let me turn my mic off. Maybe that's.
No, it's in another browser window. I had YouTube on. Okay, sorry about that. I wouldn't have been able to talk if that was going to continue. Okay, so welcome everyone to role of generative AI in education, or role of AI in general in education. But we will be getting into generative AI in particular, into a bit of a deep dive. We have a special guest with us, Ken Kahn. And we're just going to, discuss a few points on this topic. I expect that anyone watching this will leave with some really great ideas, some new, fresh ideas for how to use AI in the classroom. Walter, would you mind introducing our guest for us?
My pleasure to do so. So, of course, I used Gen AI to write an introduction to, but it was awful, so I threw it out. And I'm just going to introduce Ken from how I know Ken. So we both had our roots at MIT. Ken was at the AI lab, and he worked with Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert. I think probably Cynthia was hanging out as well, Cynthia Solomon.
Yeah.
And they were all my mentors as well at MIT. But a little bit after Ken, I was over at the Media Lab, and when Ken was finishing up his work. Ken at MIT, he was working on a really profound project in my mind. And it was looking at how to take story descriptions and turn them into animation. So in some sense, I don't know, very much generative AI, but of a different era and a different technology, but very much generative and really inspiring. He also got involved in some other projects that I've been involved in over the years. He was an early adopter of One Laptop Per Child and did some teaching with One Laptop Per Child. And as I think most of you know, One Laptop Per Child ran Sugar and still runs Sugar. And so he was an early Sugar user as well. So it's great to have him back in the camp with that. And he also, he's done a bunch of other great stuff. Toon Talk. If you don't know Toon Talk, check it out. It's fabulous. He's done a bunch of cool stuff with Snap, and I'm a big Snap fan as well. And he's just in general the way, and I'm gonna maybe inappropriately put not words, but characterize Ken in a way that maybe he won't like, but I think, a former colleague of ours, Elliot Soloway, coined the phrase learning-centric design, which I really like, and I think that Ken's work really epitomizes learning-centric design. It really is fundamentally about what learning is happening, and how do we enhance the learning. And there's often, my colleague John May 80 years ago, he really annoyed me at the Media Lab. He said, if you take the word simplicity, the word MIT is in simplicity. And his goal was to make things simple. I think that's the wrong goal. I think the goal is to the complexity that's inherent in the world. And I think Ken's work is really well aligned with the idea that the world's a complex place. We want to learn so we can master that complexity. And with that, I want to just mention Ken's most recent work, or at least the most recent work that I'm aware of, is the work that he's been doing with Gen AI. He's written a book called The Learner's Apprentice. Great book, and packed full of great ideas. And with that, I will hand it over to Ken.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Happy to be here. Um, yeah, regarding the learner-centered learning, I always was a fan of, and early on, I think Seymour Papert was talking about the low threshold, high ceiling. That was what was wrong with so many other approaches. Basic also had maybe a low ceiling, but you couldn't really do very ambitious projects in it. And
Mm.
I was attracted to Snap because it's has a much higher ceiling than Scratch does, and those kinds of things. So let's see, where do I start? So maybe I should tell a little bit of my views about AI that have changed. So, as you mentioned, even back in the 70s, I was interested in generative AI. I even wrote a paper called Three Interactions Between AI and Education. That was 1977. And the kind of AI, as you mentioned, was a different flavor than today, but it was still had the I still had the vision that you would describe some little story and you'd get a first draft back from it, and you'd say no, that character didn't react properly to this other one, redo it. So it was even back then I had the idea that you weren't just creating something through you weren't defining something in English. You weren't constructing the perfect prompt that'll create whatever it is. That it was going to be a conversation back and forth where and much of the book has the idea that it's typically the best thing to do is to ask for something much simpler than what you really want. And then once you get that, give some feedback and then ask for an improvement and then give some feedback and just incrementally work your way towards what you want. And you don't always know what you want. So it's kind of that process. Sometimes you're running out of ideas. You ask the chatbot to brainstorm and it lists 12 different ideas and 2 of them you like and you kind of pursue it. And sometimes you didn't think of an idea until you've got a prototype that you played with for a little bit. So and when I started writing the book, I was very much thinking in terms of creating computer programs. And that's still more than half of the book. But I had also started experimenting with other ways in which you can amplify your human creativity, the other kind of creative things you could be doing with it. You could have very open-ended text-based adventures. You could create illustrated stories. You could generate debates and panels where you're one of the participants, and so the range of things you could do beyond just creating apps is another part of the message. But I think given all my interest in programming languages for 50 years, I was very much leaning towards having thinking about how much could children do by creating things with chatbots. And one thing before I open up more of this discussion, I found a paper that Marvin Minsky wrote in 1991, and there's a couple paragraphs in there where he predicts pretty much today. He says that AI systems are going to make it such that the nature of programming is going to change, and that you'll be programming it at such a high level, and you won't need to be concerned with much of the technical details. And then he says, but don't worry that means that people will stop creating software. Instead, they'll be much more ambitious, that it'll enable people to create much more ambitious projects because they've got an AI supporting them. So he saw that, whatever that was, 35 years ago.
Yeah, in your book, I even found a section on music, and at Sugar Labs, we've been experimenting with that, and we can get into those sorts of things more in a little bit. If you don't mind taking a step back for context for people who might not know you know what all the meanings that are packed into AI as we know it,
Right.
and talk about that for just a few minutes, just to give us
Sure. Sure.
more general context.
So, you know, people have tried, there's probably hundreds of different definitions of AI, but I kind of prefer Marvin Minsky's, which is roughly that getting a computer to do things that if a human did it, you would call it intelligent. And the approach that was kind of a debate way back in over 50 years ago was whether you did this by creating knowledge representations in the computer. You had kind of high-level symbolic rules that you gave the computer as to how to solve problems or how to create things, versus something with neural nets. But the neural net stuff just wasn't working very well. And the symbolic AI, sometimes people now call it good old-fashioned AI, was succeeding, but not not quite as much as everybody in the field was hoping. That most of the successes tended to be either more brittle or narrower than people hoped. And then, so I was always had the attitude, and I think this was shared by most everybody in the MIT AI lab when I was there, is that a neural net is a very low-level way to think about what the mind is doing. It's kind of like trying to understand what a computer is doing by looking at every transistor or something. And that it's just too hard to work at such a low level. Even if a learning program generates it, it's much more sensible to work at the level of higher level concepts. But it was about, right when GPT-3 came out, maybe about a year before ChatGPT, I just got curious as to whether that kind of AI. So maybe I should, before I go on with the story, explain that machine learning is just a piece of AI, but it's by far the biggest piece. And then within terms of machine learning, neural nets is by far the biggest piece. And neural nets are a very simplified view of the way in which neurons in the brain behave and interact. And what people call large language models, LLMs, or chatbots like ChatGPT or Claude, they're one particular style of building a neural net. And the view a few years ago within machine learning neural nets was that you build you train a neural net to maybe detect sentiment analysis. So you would give it a bunch of reviews and don't tell it what stars the person gave, and said, was this a positive or negative review? And you would train it on lots of examples, and it would get pretty good at with new examples saying whether or not that review was positive or negative. But what happened actually in within OpenAI, as I believe in the story, it was actually with GPT-2, which goes back to probably, 2018 or something. all of these large language models at the very core, all they're doing is predicting the next word given the previous words. And somebody got the bright idea of giving it the previous words that it handed it was a movie review or a book review, followed by the sentence, this review is, or the sentiment behind this review is, and then it would complete that sentence by saying positive or negative or neutral. And they were really surprised how well it could do this, even though it was being trained just to come up with the next word, but somehow in order to predict the next word, it had to kind of have enough understanding of all the previous words to know whether or not this was a positive or negative review. So they started to see that this had more generality than they had, and that's why they started investing more and more, in GPT-3 and ChatGPT and GPT-4 and so on. And these models, these large language models or chatbots, they're just so incredibly capable in so many things. And yet, as people use them, they find that there's this problem of what people call the jagged frontier, because for some requests, they could just be, PhD level. And then for some other requests, even a toddler might do better or something. But of course, the jaggedness, it's getting better all the time, even though there still is that. And on top of that, there's this problem about hallucinations where it'll sometimes just make up things. And another criticism of it, and this is one of the things that the book addresses, I think, pretty well, is that if you just directly interact with a chatbot, it's kind of responding as it's sort of averaging the billions of things that it's read and all the different kinds of points of view and personas and styles. So it comes out very kind of bland in general. But if you ask it instead, I want you to be kind of a whimsical, poetic type, and then you start talking to it, or you say, I want you to pretend that you're Hamlet and I want to have a conversation with you, it'll switch to a kind of a fake Shakespearean English and kind of match the character in the play or something. So it's got all these styles and personas there. It's just that you need a sentence or two to sort of pull them out. Otherwise, you're dealing with something that's often pretty bland. Now, of course, the developers have been trying to fix this, so they try to work hard to make the default persona, helpful and honest, and the part of the problem you'll see as you deal with them is that they, in trying to be helpful, they often don't criticize you or don't argue back if you say things. They'll be very sycophantic. They'll kind of overly agree with you and flattering because that was the way they were trained. But again, this isn't their nature necessarily. With just a sentence or two, you could say, no, I want to have a discussion with you, and you're supposed to be a very critical reviewer of what I'm saying, and I want you to give me honest, constructive feedback, and its behavior will change.
Yeah, can I pause you there for just a second?
Sure.
So, yeah, this was the thing that I found very interesting about your approach in the book. I think chapter 3 goes over some of the things you can do, and I've taught for 20 years now. So,
Mhm.
and I was imagining its use in the classroom this way. One of the things you have here, so here are some examples. You have the personas, as you say, historical figures, characters from a novel or film. You could invent a character. It could be, an animal, a plant, or just like a material. We had a student earlier today try a rock.
Mhm.
Objects in the world like buildings, paintings, statues, places or geographic areas, and abstract concepts.
Mhm.
And earlier today, I tried, a black hole. I tried, okay, your Sagittarius A, the
Right.
black hole at the center of the Milky Way, because my son, who's 7 years old, is really into black holes.
Right.
And it's an interesting way of approaching a subject because, you know, textbook has a certain, way of introducing concepts. You know, but this has a different way, like a conversational way.
Mhm.
And the results are really interesting. And you'll butt up against these topics, and then there's still, you mentioned critical thinking. Like one uh, sentence you have here is have so after they do this activity, have students think carefully about whether the AI is portraying the character accurately. So in the case of, for example, like a historical figure, this builds critical thinking skills. So you can, as a mentor in the classroom, you
Right.
can ask to reflect upon this. What parts were accurate, what parts were not
Mhm.
accurate. um, and then you can of course build upon it, like, okay, let's turn this into a play, or a song, or what have you. But I found that to be a really refreshing
Mhm.
approach, rather than the just like kind of the utilitarian, like use it to write my homework assignment
Right.
kind
Right.
of approach that so many people are talking about today.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, one of the early discoveries I had was that you often get more interesting discussions if you isn't just the learner and the persona, but it's the learner and two or three personas.
Yeah.
So, an early experiment I did was, I wanted to pretend to be much of the book, by the way, is many of the conversations I'm pretending to be, a middle school student or high school student or whatever. And supposedly, one of them learning about gravity or something. So I had Aristotle and Galileo having a conversation, but then after every exchange, I could jump in, and they were talking about whether the Earth is at the center of the universe or the sun is or whatever. And I interrupted and then said, well, could you guys tell me how you think what about falling objects? And Aristotle tells, like he wrote 2,000 years ago, that heavier things should fall faster because, that's sort of obvious. And Galileo is very polite, says, oh, I'm so sorry to disagree, but I've done these experiments and, it's not the case. And they go back and forth about this. And then I said, even though I'm in this fantasy of talking to those two, but then I say, ChatGPT, could you bring Isaac Newton into this conversation? So now we've got another one. And he, of course, the chatbot simulating these Isaac Newton is aware of the previous conversation. And he says, you guys would be interested in my theory of gravity about how orbits and falling objects on Earth is by the same kinds of forces and stuff. So you get a kind of interesting interactions. And like you said, it doesn't have to be people. I think early on I had a very good one with just a lion and an elephant talking about how they deal with heat, or how they get enough water and salt and stuff, and they're having a good conversation, but I'm part of it. And yeah, so that's and one more thing along that lines, but I do want to get back to creating apps and computer programs, is you could ask it to create a panel discussion. And what's interesting about panel discussions is that you could you could say, oh, I want a panel discussion about generative AI in education or something. And I want, 5 participants. I want a school teacher, I don't know, a physicist, a journalist, or I don't know, whatever. I probably came up with better ones in the example. And then they start talking, but then you as the learner could take any role. You could be the moderator and ask questions of them and have them interact with each other and so on. So that for any topic, you could get different perspectives on the same topic. So yeah, there's quite a lot of interesting things that you could do, but maybe is this a good time for me to do a little 5-minute demonstration of sort of what it's like to create an app?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So I'll start sharing the screen, and I'll just say entire screen, and maybe I'll turn that on just and yeah, it's this one. All right. So one of the things that I started exploring in preparation for today is I've been, let me get rid of that notification. I've been mostly using the top 3 or 4, what they call frontier models or state-of-the-art models, so ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Copilot. And but thinking in terms of open source and free software and all that, I have always been spending a little bit of time whenever I see a new free model, open model come out, just play with it and see how well it does for the kinds of things that I've been exploring. So I went to Allen Institute of AI, who I think has one of the better practices. They've got very good people, but they, unlike others, they not only release the model, but they release the training data and the whole process of creating it and so on. And one of the ones they had that they've added the ability to follow instructions is this model. And I said to it, please create a web page as a single file that generates nonsense words. And it just completely failed. It started getting some CSS and it just didn't make any sense. And then I did the exact same thing with one that they fine-tuned that was based on the Llama model and a much bigger one, 405 billion parameters. That Meta or Facebook came out with. And in this case, it starts to explain how it's doing it, and it's saying, here's the HTML. It's up until a few months ago, all of these chatbots, when you had this, you had to kind of copy and paste this into a file and be sure to name it as an HTML file and open it up and so on. And that's still true for this particular page. But what I wanted to show you too was not only it explains things and it has made it easy to copy it, but then after I tried it, I said, good, now let's have the apps speak the word. And one of the great things about chatbots is that because they've been trained on millions and millions of programs and also all the documentation for every library and API, it didn't have any troubles incorporating a text-to-speech into the program. And here's the result of by just copying and pasting this into a file.
Motivic, Ko, Rogabe.
And so that's one of the open source ones. And DeepSeek, the Chinese one that made a big splash a few months ago, it has a nice little run button and a download button, so it makes it a little easier. So I did the exact same thing here, and we got,
Preemie, nodded, Overlove.
But one of the things I think happened though was it made a more complicated one, but they weren't always pronounceable. So I said make it pronounceable and be able to speak it. And there's another open model, Gwen, also from China, and it's good too. I pretty much tried the same thing. And
Maybe. Viewable.
And
Living.
one of the things that make it, I should say, for it to generate these things takes a minute or two. But if I say, let's see, if I say add a slider to control the number of syllables, I don't know if I spelled it right, but it doesn't matter. And, very quickly it's regenerating the code. And so one of the questions that keeps coming up is, okay, if it could do all this programming, does it mean that students don't need to learn to program? And if a student is eager to learn to program, this is a great way to do it because you could ask questions, you could explain, work together with it. Let's see how this worked, by the way.
Mom. Lipa.
I don't know if that's quite.
Kagone. Kokanadza. Jatelihaka.
You could keep going. You could ask it to generate fictional dictionary entries or to give the. I asked it for the Gettysburg Address, but every third word replaced by a nonsense word. All these things are.
I want to pick up on that thread a little bit. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about really sort of two things, two aspects of this work, because I think it's brilliant. But so one of them is just the debugging process itself and the sort of channel synth, the power happens in the debugging, and maybe you could address that a little bit. And then the other is just sort of the basic dichotomy between artifact and learning. We're making things, but we're learning in the making, learning in the doing.
Right. Let me do the second part first and come back to debugging. So I think there's a lot of very valuable things you're learning, even if the learner is not very concerned with learning a programming language or the computational processes underlying it. That there's a lot of just designing things and redesigning them and improving them and providing useful feedback to the chatbot to do kind of critical thinking like that, and just generally improving kind of communication skills and so on. And also, I think for many of these examples I work through, I think you still get the higher level sense of what's going on, especially if you just read the paragraph summarizes what's going on. And you could here, let me go back to this one. If I say, please explain how the program works to a 10-year-old with no programming experience. And these things are quite good at coming up with explaining how it works, that they've got boxes with different consonants and vowels in it and how it picks them up randomly and mixes them and then how it does the talking. And you could dig deeper if you want or not. And if you are interested in more learning more about computation, you can ask. The code is right here. It's showing it. My problem is that every one of these, I think if I click here, you should be able to see the code. Yeah, here's all the code. You could ask about, what does this part do or something, So if you're all curious, what does do? And so I think as somebody who wants to learn about programming, this could be a fantastic tool. And for somebody who's more interested in a scientific simulation or doing some kind of project where they just want to put all their effort into being more and more ambitious rather than learning about the underlying programming, I think it could be a great tool. Now, one of the things that Seymour Papert wrote about from early on, even at least 1970, was that by learning a programming language, learners are learning kind of a new concepts and vocabulary for thinking about how complex systems work, about how dynamic processes interact. And that could even maybe contribute to a more useful way for them to think about their own thinking and problem solving and so on. And that some of that might get lost if the learner instead is just has this idea of a really complicated game and they just want to, as quickly as possible, get that built. But my own view is I don't, children, they all have different goals and ideas of what they want to do. And I think what's great about these chatbots is that they support all these different styles. That the one that's just really focused on creating artifacts, the ones that really wants to learn about computation and programming languages. And one thing I did experiment with, maybe I don't need to keep sharing the screen anymore. If I could. Is doing programming with pseudocode. So the idea I had was that programming languages, the designers are always trying to make a optimal trade-off between a system that enables programs to be both written and read. And if the AI is doing most of the writing, it's not that important about the writing part, but then you want the reading part to be optimal. And pseudocode is what programmers will often write in papers to each other because it's the most readable form of showing what a program does. And you could ask a chatbot, okay, I'm trying to understand the high level ideas about programming, but I don't really want to get into the syntax and details of a programming language. So always show me pseudocode, but then behind the scenes, write JavaScript or Python so I could experiment with the programs that we're building together. And that's an interesting middle ground that I think maybe the best one, given the way the technology is moving.
I do have one anecdote I'd like to share on this topic. So I guess I haven't really brought this too much into like my classes, but with my son about a year ago, so I think he was about 6 or like a young 7. Together with him at the computer, we did some prompts for some applications in Python. So we asked it to make some simple games in Python, and then we put it into Pippy, which is in the Sugar desktop environment. So he was using that on his computer, and that just runs the Python code, and then you can modify it and run it again and debug. And the interesting thing for me, just observing how we were using it together, was we had code that worked, just copy paste, and then he had some ideas, and then I had to help him find where in the code he'd have to go to modify those. Like So I remember one of the messages wasn't what, worded the way he wanted it to be worded.
Right.
I think he wanted to remix it kind of as a Pokemon game, if I remember correctly. So then it was like, so this is where you need to change it. And then I think he chopped off like a comma or something at the end.
Right.
And so then it was like, well, you got to put that back or it's not going to work. And so it's, we covered some of this, the topics I think you'd get into in like a Python class, or if you were going through a textbook, but it was, starting from, a program, that worked, and that was his, and then he could just like kind of identify, certain parts and kind of work with it, at his own pace. So that was cool.
Yeah. So I've tried experiments where I start off with, again, like when we have a paragraph saying, pretending to be a certain age student for learning Python for the first time or whatever, and saying, don't give me full answers, but, help me work through doing things. And then, but I pretended I knew very little, and I didn't know how to, do even basic stuff. And then pretty quickly I got an error message because I was trying to add two strings that look like numbers. And I, told it about this message that came up. And I was really impressed with how it was really trying to explain what was going on about strings and numbers, and at a level that was appropriate for, the age I was pretending to be. And then it started asking, well, for this program, do you think it should be, a decimal number or an integer or something? It was even trying to use, vocabulary that matches more what kids that age. And then I said, a decimal, and then it said, well, do you know how to turn a string into a decimal? And I said, I had no idea. And it says, oh, well, there's this float operation. And then I said, well, how do you use it? And it was just, I think that was it felt like a way in which I would have liked to first learn to program way back, long time ago. But one thing about the Python versus the web apps do have some advantages. First off, it's all nicely integrated. You don't have to do the copy and paste, for most of them. It just appears on the right side, and it's so easy to share it with somebody. Most of these chatbots will give you a published link, and you just send somebody the link, and then they could play with whatever you built. And schools probably are more happy to have something that they already have the browsers. They don't know what people might do with Python or something, so that, because browsers have this sort of a sandbox where you can't really easily kind of mess up the file system or do dangerous things. So, and it's so capable, right? There's so many, just like with Python, there's so many millions of libraries, but in general, it's sort of, I think, easier to create a more visually exciting app as a web page than going through all the efforts that you need to do to make something like that in Python. But of course, even though 95% of the examples in the book are HTML, JavaScript, CSS, the same ideas apply if you are trying to prefer to do things in Python or in Logo. Though when I mentioned the word logo, there is a little catch here, which is that the ability of these chatbots to do a good job of programming depends upon whether it's seen lots and lots of examples of programs in that language. And so it's seen a lot more, Java, Python, C++, those kind of languages. And the problem I had when I tried to get it to create logo programs is that it actually got the ideas right, but there's so many different dialects. Everyone has a different way you set the color, or how you abbreviate things, and it was mixing up different dialects, and it just wasn't a very good experience. And similarly, when you try to have it, you ask it, well, how could I in Snap make a program to do X? It says, well, I can't really show you the Snap code, but here's the textual equivalent of it. Now you should find these blocks and connect them up and try this. So it's giving you instructions, but and even then, because Snap doesn't have as many millions of examples in its training. If you got into anything that's a bit out of the most commonly used blocks in Snap, it wasn't quite up on how to get Snap to I don't know, do something with speech or whatever. So it kind of pushes you to sticking with the top 5 or 10 most popular languages in the world, because that's what it's most capable of supporting.
Yeah, I was gonna say we definitely struggle with that. For example, with music blocks and Turtle Art and those other variants as
Yeah.
well. There's just not enough of a. It doesn't know enough about them, and we put some effort into trying to teach it more about them. I mean, music blocks is particularly difficult because it does. These models know a lot about music theory, sort of. But when you get into some of the details, it oftentimes gets confused. And between that confusion and the confusion of the language it's not very familiar with, you really can get yourself deep into a hole pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of that might be, now that I've gone on this adventure, Ken, you might not know this, but I'm a musician. But I've, 10 years ago, I kind of, went on this journey, and now here I am today. When I look back at Wikipedia, with this knowledge of, how we do things, as a kind of developer community, I kind of see a dearth of good documentation, if you will, for musical concepts like on Wikipedia, and I could see actually the Zen Wiki is a good one, but it's specifically microtonal, and that's because I think that the microtonal community is especially geeky, and they love they love looking into the math. They have to know the math really to do their craft, and then a lot of them do programming, and that's partly out of necessity. In order to make their ideas come to life,
Right.
they need to create their own tools and come up with some and programming is a great way of doing that. We should probably move to some other topics. We do have a question, and I think this is a good question. It's here from Rishikesh. He's asking, what is the best way to debug code generated by AI? And maybe we can put a education spin on that. Like what's the best way to bring that into the classroom, debugging it in the classroom. In fact, we have several projects this summer specifically for debugging. So I think it'll be apt to discuss this now.
Yeah, so I've experimented with lots of responses to when the chatbot has generated buggy code. And a few times I've just tried, just as a quick experiment, to give it some buggy code that I wrote or found and say, could you find a bug in this or something? But when it's its own generated bug, the first thing is to explain to it that it's not doing what it's supposed to. First off, of course, there's the bugs where there's some exception that stops the whole thing, and you have to go to the console or something, and you see this inscrutable error message. I mean, inscrutable to a typical 10-year-old or something. And it's surprisingly often that if you just copy and paste it over to the chat, the chatbot will say, "Oh, I see what's wrong. We did this instead of this. Let's fix this," or we declared this as a constant 2 different places, or whatever it is. And part of the issue there, though, let me give you one more example before I talk about this issue. Other cases where I've said, it just isn't computing the right thing. The thing is not moving properly or whatever. So I even say, well, how do you think we should debug this? And it says, oh, well, maybe I should insert some print statements, and then you could copy and paste the output back to me, and we could look at what's going on. And again, it's if you're really eager to understand things deeply, then it's a great tool for that too, because you could ask it, well, here's the log, how can we figure out what's wrong? And you could even tell it, don't just, I want to learn how to do this. Don't just, give me the answer, and it could help you make sense out of this, or discover that we don't have enough information. We need to add more print statements, or whatever it is. But there is this risk that you're not really acquiring these debugging skills that people like Seymour Papert, very elegantly argued, is a very general skill that's a lot like doing just problem solving in general, or doing scientific research or something. The idea of trying to narrow down what a problem is, figuring out how to what needs changing to get things to work. If you're still dealing with those issues, but you're leaving the chatbot to deal with a lot of the technical lower level issues there, and whether you're missing out there isn't clear. And of course, some people will want to get into those details, and others will want to quickly get their bug fixed so they could more quickly get their app working. And I think it's good that it could support both kinds of learners.
You got a thumbs up from your response.
I saw that. Nice. Thank you, somebody.
I think we could talk for hours longer, but we do have a real hard stop coming up. I encourage anyone watching this, if you really want to deep dive, you can pick up Ken's book. It's really helpful. If you don't have a lot of time, you don't have to go cover to cover.
Mm-hmm, right.
That's one thing that one of my teachers taught me in college.
Right.
And I kept that with me. You can, there's a lot of great topics in here that you can, just kind of use as a reference. And then you have a website too. There's like links to
the website's
your logs.
pretty important appendix to the because there's over 100 examples in the book. But if I put into the book the full conversations and discussion of what's going on in those conversations, it would have been many times larger. So most of the time, I had to summarize some of the conversation, or just discuss the highlights. But for every one of those, there's a link to the online appendix where there's the full conversation and whatever the artifact that was being created, the web app or the illustrated story or the debate or whatever it is, so that anybody that wants to see the full details, it's out there.
And if I may, can I bring Sagittarius A in for the final word?
Sure.
So this is right, in honor of our meeting, one of our contributors who's here with us right now, our nickname for him is Mostly K, cooked up this chat bot, this web app, and I asked it, so you give it a persona. I said, you're Sagittarius A star. the black hole at the center of the Milky Way. I asked it a few questions. What drives you? Do you feel like you're in control? If you met an even larger black hole, would you accept your fate? What's at your core? You know, and of course it talks about singularities. And then at the end, I said, I invite you to add your thoughts to a conversation I'm having with Ken Kahn and Walter Bender on the topic of the role of AI in education. As a black hole, perhaps you could share your thoughts. And Sagittarius A star responds, the role of AI in education. The phrase itself is a ripple in the space-time of knowledge. Consider education as the accumulation of information like matter drawn into a gravitational well. AI then can act as a lensing effect, focusing knowledge, distorting its path, and potentially magnifying its impact on the minds of learners. I like this next part. Ken Kahn and Walter Bender, like stars orbiting a common center of gravity, represent different approaches to this question.
Wow.
One might emphasize the inherent gravitational pull of AI, the way it inevitably shapes the learning landscape, while the other might focus on the subtle distortions it introduces. And then in the last paragraph, it says, from my perspective, the challenge lies in ensuring that AI does not become an event horizon, trapping learners with predefined paths, preventing exploration beyond the readily available. So there you have it.
Yeah. Wow. That's really good. Yep.
Not bad. Yeah. Cool.
And I think the word exploration is critical here, that, you know, everybody should just try these things and explore and see what comes out.
So I'll put the link to that in the comments,
Oh,
so
good.
that if anyone wants to try it, they can try it. Thank you so much again, Ken, for your time, and for sharing a little bit of the wisdom from your latest book.
No, I enjoy this. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Ken, thank you. Pleasure.
Good.
Okay, so I ended the stream on YouTube.